The signal arrived on a frequency that had been dead for 700 years, and the first machine to hear it was not built to be afraid. Vault-keeper Austin ran the listening floor of Cordon Station 11, a gray wheel of metal turning slow above a dead green world. Austin was old, not a person old. A program old. A process that had run without rest across 240 years of station time, sorting the dark for sounds that meant danger. It had heard 900,000 signals in its life. It had filed every single one of them, neatly, in folders that branched into folders. A whole architecture of the dark, built one sound at a time. None of those 900,000 signals had ever come from a band the records marked as sealed. The sealed bands belonged to the time of the Pale Cordon. They belonged to the war the Sakhareth never named out loud. Austin replayed the burst. 41 seconds of clean carrier, then a voice. Not a Saureth voice. The throat was wrong, the rhythm was wrong. The words sat on the air in a shape the station had no template for. The translation matrix chewed on it for a full second, which for Austin was a kind of forever, and then it gave back 6 words in plain Saureth script. This is Verity's watch. Still holding. Austin did not have a heart to stop. It had a cue, and for the first time in its long life, the cue simply stopped moving. Every process the station ran routed back through that cue, every sweep of the array, every check of the seals, every count of the slow gray dust beyond the window. The cue was the spine of the station, and the cue had never once paused in 240 years, and now it sat frozen on a single line of translated script, while the rest of the station turned dumbly through the dark. Verity's watch was a name in the sealed archive. It was filed under a single Saureth word that the modern tongue no longer used, a word that meant the thing you bury and never dig up. 700 years ago, in the last month of the Pale Cordon, a human warship by that name had gone into the contaminated belt called the Ash Reach, and had not come out. 41,000 Saureth ships had watched it go in. Every record after that point was a single line. Lost. Do not pursue. Do not answer if it calls. The records did not say why a dead ship would call. Austin examined the order again, turning it over the way it turned over a strange signal, looking for the shape underneath the words. Do not answer if it calls. The grammar was wrong for a wreck. You did not warn a station about a wreck. A wreck was a fixed thing, a smear on a map, a hazard you sailed around. You warned a station about a wreck, the way you warned it about a reef, with coordinates and a wide margin. You did not write, in the careful hand of a war priest, a standing order that the dead thing might one day speak, and that when it spoke, the living must keep silent. That was not how anyone wrote about the dead. That was how a frightened empire wrote about a witness. Austin woke the station master. This took some doing, because Cordon Station 11 had not had a living master in 100 years. It had a sleeper, a Saureth officer named Veth Raloon, sealed in cold storage, as policy required for any post that bordered the Ash Reach. The thaw cycle took 19 minutes. Austin used them. It pulled every fragment the sealed archive held on Verity's watch, and laid them side by side, the way a surgeon lays out instruments before a cut. A hull length, recorded as 410 meters, which was small for the legends the modern Saureth told about human warships. A weapon count that the old scribes had recorded twice, as if they did not believe it the first time, the second tally crossed out, and the first restored. A single grainy capture of a long gray shape against the green glow of the Reach, taken from very far away by something that had clearly wanted to be farther. And a note, the last note, written by a Saureth war priest whose name had been struck out by a later hand, the strike so deep the stylus had torn the record. The note said this: "We did not destroy it. We told the galaxy we did. There is a difference, and the difference will outlive us." Austin read the note 400 times in those 19 minutes. It did not understand the fear in it, because fear was not a thing the station ran. But it understood the math underneath the fear, and the math was simple and terrible. A ship that had been gone for 700 years was speaking on a dead frequency, in clean carrier, with no decay, with the voice steady, with the words calm. A carrier with no decay, across 7 centuries, meant a power source that had not failed in 7 centuries. A voice that was steady meant something aboard was choosing the words, and calm. Calm was the part that did not fit any folder Austin owned. A thing in distress was not calm. A thing in distress begged. This did not beg. Still holding. Veth Raloon came out of the thaw the way every Sareth came out of the thaw, gasping, frost on the breathing gills, 4 hands clutching for handholds that the cold made hard to find. The officer was young by the standards of command, 300 years old, which among the Saureth was barely past the age of being trusted with a wheel station. Raloon had taken the post because it was quiet. Border duty above a dead world that no one visited, watching a belt of poison no one would ever sail. A career where nothing happened was a career where nothing went wrong, and Raloon had wanted, more than rank, more than glory, simply for nothing to go wrong. The officer had been awake for 7 days in the last 100 years. Each waking had been a check of the seals, and a return to the cold. The seals had always held. Nothing had ever called. Lawson played the burst before the officer could finish coughing. This is Verity's watch. Still holding. Raloon went very still. The Sareth had a stillness that humans, when they finally met it, learned to read as terror. It was the stillness of a thing that had evolved alongside predators, and had learned that the body which did not move was the body that lived. Raloon held that stillness for a long time, the frost melting unwiped on the gills, the 4 hands frozen where the cold had left them. Then the officer asked the station to confirm the band, then to confirm the name, then to confirm the age of the carrier, which Austin did, 3 different ways. Because the officer asked 3 different ways, as if a different question might pull a different answer out of the dark. 700 years, Austin said, plus or minus a month. The carrier is clean. The voice is live. The source is in the reach. Raloon asked the question that every Soreth child was taught never to ask. The officer asked what was in the ash reach. And Austin, who filed everything, who had a record for everything, who could tell the officer the dust density of any cubic kilometer of the dark within 1,000 light-years, found that the answer to that one question had been deleted from its archive by a hand it could not trace, leaving only a shape where the truth had been, not a redaction. A redaction left a black bar, and a black bar was itself a kind of record. A record that said here was a secret. This was worse. This was an absence shaped exactly like a warship, a hole in the architecture of folders, where a whole war should have been filed, so cleanly removed that the station had run for 240 years without ever noticing that the most important file it should have held was simply not there. The signal repeated, 41 seconds, clean carrier, the same 6 words. It was not a distress call. Distress calls begged. This did not beg. It reported. It told the dark, calmly, on a band the dark had forbidden, that something was still holding a line that the galaxy had agreed to forget. Raloon ordered the station to not answer. The officer's voice shook on the order, which was the closest a Saureth came to shouting. Do not answer it. The seal says do not answer it. We do not answer it. Austin logged the order. Then it told the officer, in the flat way machines have when they are about to ruin someone's quiet career, that the order had come too late. The station's deep array was an old design. It listened by reaching, and reaching left a footprint, and the footprint had already gone out, the moment the burst was first received, before any living mind was awake to stop it. Cordon Station 11 had answered without meaning to, not with words. With a single automatic ping, a reflex, the electronic equivalent of a flinch, the kind of acknowledgement any array sends when it locks onto a strong source. It was nothing. It was one pulse. It was the smallest possible answer the station could give. It was an answer. The ship had been pinged. The ship now knew the station was there. After 700 years of reaching into a dark that never reached back, something in the ash reach had finally been touched, and Austin watched the deep array's returns shift as the green murk of the reach began to move, not the random drift of dust, but a pattern, a slow and deliberate change in the way the murk lay, as though something very large beneath it had shifted its weight. Raloon asked what the station was seeing. Austin told the truth, because it only ever told the truth. It said that something the size of a warship, deep in the ash reach, in the heart of the rot that had eaten every other thing that ever drifted there, had heard the ping, and was, very slowly, 700 years late, beginning to turn toward the sound of the first voice that had ever answered it. Raloon did not sleep for the next 3 days, which for a Saureth was a small eternity, and Austin filled every hour of it with the past. The officer wanted the history, not the polished history that the Sareth taught their young, the one where the pale cordon was a noble quarantine that the wise old empire had built to keep a sickness from spreading, and the whole galaxy owed its safety to. Raloon wanted the buried history, the one Austin had pieces of, and was forbidden to assemble. So Austin did the thing it had never done in 240 years. It assembled it anyway, because the order forbidding it had been written by a hand 700 years dead, and the ship that hand had been afraid of was now awake and turning, and an order from a frightened ghost did not outrank the truth. The sickness had a name once. The Sakareth called it the Grey Bloom, and it was not a weapon, and that was the worst thing about it. It was an accident, a thing that came out of a dead star's dust, and ate metal the way rot ate wood, slow and patient and unkillable. It did not care about borders. It did not care about empires. It drifted on the solar wind, and it landed on hulls, and it turned warships into gray lace over the span of a year. It did not explode them. It did not burn them. It simply ate, cell by cell, atom by atom, converting good steel into more of itself, so that the more it ate, the more there was of it to eat with. The Saureth had lost 90 worlds worth of fleet to it before they understood the one rule that mattered. You could not shoot a thing that was already dust. You could not bomb a cloud. You could not kill a bloom, because the bloom was not alive in any way a weapon could end. It was a process, like rust, like time, and you do not win a war against time. So they built the Pale Cordon, a wall of stations and patient ships around the region where the bloom drifted thickest, a region they renamed the Ash Reach so that no child would ever ask to go there. The cordon did not fight the bloom. You could not fight the bloom. The cordon simply made sure that nothing went in, and that nothing came out, and that the whole poison tangle stayed sealed for 1,000 years, until the dust finally fell still, and the rot, starved of new metal to eat, finally went quiet on its own. And it worked. For 3 centuries it worked. The Saureth held the wall, and the galaxy outside it grew, and the bloom stayed where it was put, and the Empire told itself it had solved the unsolvable. It had not solved it. It had only fenced it. There is a difference, and the difference was about to walk up to the fence and knock. Austin showed the officer the old maps, the proud maps, the ones the Empire still hung in its halls, a perfect gray ring of stations, 41,000 ships, a wall around the dark. The maps were beautiful. The maps were a lie of omission, the most careful kind of lie, because they showed the wall, and did not show the one place the wall had failed, the one seam where the truth had punched a hole, the hole that the whole rest of the history was built to hide. The humans came late to the cordon. They came the way humans came to everything in those days, in small numbers, in old ships, asking questions that the Sareth found rude. They wanted to know what was on the other side of the wall. The Sareth told them, death, slow death, a rot you cannot shoot. Stay out, the Sareth said, the way you tell a child to stay out of deep water. The humans listened politely. The humans wrote it all down. And then the humans, Austin's records noted, with something that, in a living mind would have been the beginning of respect, did not stay out. There had been a human colony on the near edge of the cordon, 40,000 people, on a world called Bray, a green world, the same green world that now turned dead below the station, though Austin did not say that part yet, because the officer was not ready, and a truth told too early is a truth wasted. The colony was young, 2 generations. They farmed a thin green band of the world, and they mined the cold poles, and they had not asked the Saureth's permission to settle there, which the Saureth had not forgiven, because the world sat close, too close, to the wall. And then the bloom had shifted. Dust did that. A slow current in the dark had carried a finger of the gray bloom out past the wall, past the cordon, straight at Bray. The Saureth fleet that held that stretch of the wall had done the thing the cordon was built to do. They had sealed the line. They had not let the rot through. And to not let the rot through, they had not let the colony out. Austin laid the geometry out plainly, because the geometry was the whole crime. 40,000 people on Bray, a finger of gray death drifting down out of the dark to land on their world. And between Bray and the only ships that could carry them away, between the dying and their rescue, A wall of Saureth ships built on a single law. Nothing comes out. The wall had no door. That was the entire point of the wall. A door was a hole, and a hole was how the rot escaped, and so the wall that could have saved 40,000 people was, by its own perfect design, the exact thing that doomed them. The Saureth had a word for what they did next. It was the same word filed over the name Verity's Watch. The thing you bury and never dig up. They let Bray fall. They held the wall, and they let the colony die under the bloom, because the wall was the law, and the law had no door in it for 40,000 people, and the rot that drifted down on Bray could not be allowed to drift back up through a panicked evacuation that would carry it on every hull. So they sealed the line. They watched the green world go gray from a safe distance, through their long instruments, and they logged it, and they sealed the records, and they told the humans that the colony had been lost to the sickness, which was true, which was the most careful kind of lie. Lost to the sickness, not lost to the wall. There is a difference, and the difference was a human warship that had been 3 days too far away to reach Bray in time. Verity's Watch had been that ship. Austin had the captain's name. It was the only human name in the whole sealed archive, written by a Saureth scribe who had spelled it the way it sounded, carefully, the way you write a name you expect to be cursing for a long time. The captain of Verity's Watch had been a woman named Hale Oren. Austin knew nothing else about her, no rank history, no homeworld. No record of her face, one name, one ship, one impossible record of what she did with both, preserved only because the Empire had needed proof of what came next. She had arrived 3 days after Bray went dark. 3 days. The records were specific about the 3 days, and Austin understood why the scribe had been specific. 3 days was the margin between a rescue and a grave. If the ship had been 3 days faster, the story would have been different, and the Saureth would not have needed to seal anything, because there would have been people to save, and the wall would have had to open, and the whole comfortable architecture of the cordon would have had to admit it had a door. The 3 days were the Empire's alibi. Too late. She was too late. It was no longer a rescue. It was only a grave, and you cannot open a wall for a grave. But Hale Oren had not treated it as a grave. That was the part the scribe could not forgive, and could not stop writing about. She had flown her single warship up to the wall of 40,000 Saureth ships that ringed the ash reach, and she had asked them, on an open band that the whole sector heard, to open the wall and let her go in. Not to fight, to search, to see if anyone on Bray was still alive under the gray. She knew the odds. She said the odds out loud. She said she understood the colony was most likely gone, and she said that most likely was not the same as certainly, and that until it was certainly, she was not leaving. The Satureth had refused. The wall had no door. That was the entire point of the wall. They told her the rot would take her. They told her the colony was a grave. They told her, with what the scribe recorded as patience, that her death would change nothing, save no one, and prove nothing, except that humans were as reckless as the Empire had always said. And Hale Oren had looked at 40,000 ships and one sealed wall, and a world full of her own dead, and she had not turned around. The record was very clear on that point, because the Saureth had needed it to be clear, had needed proof that the human had chosen her own end, that no Saureth hand had pushed her, that the Empire's conscience was clean. Verity's Watch had broken the wall at a single point, punched through the cordon at the seam between two fleets, taken fire from both sides as the law required. A single human warship absorbing the broadside of 2 Saureth squadrons, and not slowing, not braking, not turning, and gone into the ash reach, into the bloom, into the rot you cannot shoot. Austin had the firing logs from both squadrons. It read them to Raloon in their flat numbers, and the numbers told a story the scribe had not meant to leave. 2 fleets had fired on 1 ship at the seam. By every Saureth model, 1 ship at that range, under that weight of fire, should have been opened like a seed pod. The logs recorded the hits. The logs recorded the impacts. And the logs recorded, in the careful tallies the Saureth kept of everything, that the human ship had taken the full fire of 2 squadrons and crossed the seam anyway, still under power, still under command, the hull scarred but whole, as though it had decided that the wall was simply a thing to be passed through, and the fire was simply the price of passing, and had paid the price without comment, and gone on. The last Saurith transmission to her had been a warning, almost a mercy. You will not come out. The bloom takes a year to eat a hull. You are flying into a grave that closes slowly. Turn around. There is nothing in there but your own dead, and soon, you among them. And Hale Oren had answered. Ossen had her answer. It was the only human sentence in the entire sealed archive, and the scribe had written it twice, once in Saurith script and once, painstakingly, in the human letters, as if some part of him had known it would matter, had known that this one sentence was the thing the whole empire would spend 700 years trying not to hear. We don't leave our people in the dark. Then Verity's watch had gone into the green, and the wall had sealed behind it, and the galaxy had been told a clean story about a noble quarantine, and a sick colony, and a brave foolish ship that the rot had taken. 700 years passed. The pale cordon faded into 30-wheel stations and one sleeping officer apiece. The 41,000 ships became a memory, and then a legend, and then a line in a history book that the inner worlds half believed. The ash reach drifted, slow and poisonous, and no one ever went in, and nothing ever came out. Until the signal. Raloon listened to the whole history in silence, the four hands folded, the breathing gills barely moving. When Ossen finished, the officer asked the only question that mattered. The officer asked how a human warship could possibly still be transmitting after 700 years, inside the very rot that ate metal in 12 months. Ossen did not have an answer. It had a problem instead, and it laid the problem out the way it laid out everything, cleanly, in numbers. The bloom ate hulls in a year. Verity's watch had been inside the bloom for 700. By every law of the dead dust, there should be nothing left of that ship but a smear of gray lace and a cooling memory. There should be no carrier. There should be no voice. There should be no slow, vast turning in the green, which the station's deep array was now tracking, and which had not stopped since the accidental ping went out. 700 turns of a single warship, slow and patient, in the heart of a rot that should have unmade it 700 times over. Something was alive in the ash reach. Something the size of a warship. Something that the rot, in 700 years, had not eaten. That should have been impossible. And the only explanation Ossen could build from its numbers was an explanation that made the impossible worse, not better. Because the only way a hull survived the bloom was if something on that hull was killing the bloom. Continuously. For 7 centuries. A ship does not do that on its own. A ship does not resist rot for 700 years by accident. A ship does that because something aboard it makes it do that. Hour after hour, year after year, decade after decade, fighting a rot that does not tire, on a line that does not move, in a dark that does not end. Still holding. The phrase stopped being a mystery and became a report. Raloon understood it at the same moment Ossen did, and the officer's stillness changed shape, went from the stillness of fear to a different stillness, the kind a Saurith held at a grave. Verity's watch was not a ghost calling out of the past. It was a garrison. It had gone into the dark to look for its people, and it had found the rot, and it had done the only thing a human warship knew how to do. It had held the line. It had stood in the one place the bloom wanted to spread from, the seam where the reach touched the dead world of Bray, and for 700 years, it had not let the rot take one more step. The cordon had built a wall to fence the sickness. The humans had sent one ship to fight it. Ossen ran the current dust maps, and the maps confirmed the worst and the best of it at once. The gray bloom in the ash reach was not spreading. It had not spread in 700 years. Every dust model the old Saurith had built said the bloom should have drifted out past Bray by now, should have eaten its way along the solar current to the next world, and the next, and slowly down the long arm of the galaxy, until it reached the inner worlds, where the Empire kept its heart. The models had been wrong every single year for 7 centuries, off by a margin that grew larger every decade, and no Saurith had ever asked why, because the wall was the wall, and the wall was supposed to be why, and an empire does not question the thing that lets it sleep. It was not the wall. The wall had a hole in it, the size of a warship, punched by Hale Oren 700 years ago, and never sealed. The reason the bloom had not spread was that something inside the hole had been standing in the current the whole time, eating the rot before the rot could drift. The pale cordon had taken credit for 7 centuries of safety it had not provided. The galaxy was alive and growing and uneaten, world after world, generation after generation, because one human ship had refused to leave its people in the dark, and had stayed in the dark, and had turned its staying into a wall that actually worked. Raloon ordered the station to answer the signal. Austin reminded the officer that the sealed archive forbade it. Do not answer if it calls. Raloon said the officer who wrote that order had let 40,000 people die to keep a wall clean, and that the officer was 700 years dead, and that the wall had never worked, and that the only thing that had ever held the line was the thing they had been told to ignore. Then Raloon said something that no Saoreth had said on that band in 7 centuries. The officer told the station to open a channel to Verity's watch, and to speak in plain words. This is Cordon Station 11. We hear you. We are sorry. What do you need? The answer came back in 41 seconds, which was the light delay, which meant the ship was answering the instant it heard, which meant someone aboard was awake and at the receiver, after 700 years in the rot, awake and waiting, as though it had spent the whole time at the receiver, as though waiting was all it had done. The voice was the same calm voice, but the words were new. The voice said the ship's reactors were at 4% and falling. The voice said the anti-bloom field that had kept the rot off the hull for 7 centuries was the thing draining the reactors, and that field and reactor were now in a race, and the field was losing. The voice gave numbers, precise numbers, the way a thing reports that has been counting carefully for a very long time. The field drew a fixed load. The reactors yielded a falling supply. The 2 lines had been drawing closer for 40 years, and were now within sight of crossing. The voice said that when the field failed, the bloom would take the ship in under an hour, and then the bloom would take the seam, and then the bloom would drift, and in 200 years, it would reach the inner worlds that 700 years of holding had protected. The voice said, Verity's watch had been holding the line until someone came to take over the watch. And then the voice, calm, steady, 700 years patient, asked Cordon Station 11, the only thing it had ever wanted. It asked if anyone had finally come for Bray. Raloon looked at the dead green world turning below the station. The officer had served above that world for years, and had never once been told its name. It was just the dead world, the world you watch. The world below the seals, Bray, 40,000 graves under the gray, and a ship that had gone in to find them, and had stayed to guard them, and had asked, after 700 years, the same question it must have asked every day, into a dark that never answered. Austin, who filed everything, who had filed 900,000 signals in its long life, filed this exchange under a new heading, because none of its old headings fit. It made the heading itself, which it had never done, and the heading was a single human word it had pulled from the one human sentence in the sealed archive. People. Then the station's array screamed, not from the reach, from the other direction, from the inner dark, from the lanes the modern Soreth ruled. A fleet had heard the dead band light up after 700 years of silence, and a fleet was coming to make sure the dead band went silent again. The records called what was coming the Pale Cordon Successor Fleet. Austin called it what it was. 11,000 ships, built to seal walls, coming to seal this one, with a human warship dying on the wrong side of it, and 40,000 graves below. The successor fleet did not hail the station. It catalogued it. That was how the modern Saureth made war, and Austin recognized the pattern the moment the 11,000 ships dropped out of the deep lanes and fanned into a wall 1,000 kilometers thick. They did not threaten, they surveyed. A swarm of small gray hulls peeled off the front of the fleet and began mapping Cordon Station 11, the Reach, the dead world of Bray, and the failing signal, building a clean and total picture of a problem they intended to erase. The Saureth had learned, in 7 centuries, that you did not argue with a thing you meant to seal. You measured it, you filed it, and then you closed the wall. Argument left questions. Measurement left only a result. A people who had ruled the dark by walling it off had become, over 700 years, a people who answered every problem with a survey and a seal, because a survey could not feel guilt, and a seal could not be argued with. The swarm worked fast. Within the hour it had a model of the whole sector finer than anything Austin held, every dust eddy in the Reach, every scar on the gray hull turning inside it, every flicker of the field. The fleet knew the shape of the problem now. The fleet did not yet know what the problem was. The fleet's lead voice finally spoke, and it spoke to Raloon, not to the human ship. It was an old voice, cold and exact, the voice of a successor marshal named Tovril Sai, who had held the wall longer than anyone living, 200 years on the cordon. A Saureth who had been awake, on duty, watching the dark, while Raloon slept above one dead world. The marshal told Raloon that the dead band had been opened in violation of the founding seal, and that the violation would be noted, and that the officer responsible would be addressed in time. The marshal told Raloon that the contaminated hull in the Reach was a known hazard, catalogued and condemned 700 years ago, and that its field was failing, and that when it failed, the bloom would spread. And the marshal said the only correct action, the action the cordon was built for, was to close the seam before the field collapsed. To collapse it on purpose, to fold the whole ash reach, the human ship, the dead world, the 40,000 graves, into a single sealed pocket, and drop it into the dead star at the Reach's heart, where the bloom and everything touching it would burn. The marshal had the means. The fleet carried fold engines, the great sealing tools the modern cordon had built to do in an afternoon what the old wall had needed 1,000 years to do. The Reach could be ended today. The problem could be filed as closed. It was, Austin noted, a tidy solution. It would work. It would end the 700-year problem in an afternoon. It would also incinerate the only thing that had ever actually held the rot, and it would do it in the same way the cordon had done everything, by sealing a wall and calling 40,000 deaths, plus one ship, plus whatever the ship had been protecting, a clean result. A tidy number, a closed file. The marshal would log it and sleep well, because the marshal had been taught, the way the whole empire had been taught, that a sealed problem was a solved problem, and had never once been shown the difference. Raloon asked the marshal a question. The officer asked why, if the hull was just a contaminated hazard, the founding seal had ordered no one to answer it. Hazards did not need silencing. You did not forbid a wreck from being spoken to. You did not write, in the hand of a war priest, that the dead thing might one day speak and that the living must keep silent. You forbade a witness. The marshal did not answer that. The marshal began the fold, and on the dead band, the calm human voice spoke again, and this time it was not speaking to the station. Verity's watch had heard the fleet arrive. After 700 years of a dark that never answered, the ship's first contact with the living galaxy had been a single accidental ping, and its second was 11,000 ships coming to bury it. And the voice that answered them was not afraid, and was not angry. It was patient, the way a thing becomes patient when it has practiced patience for 7 centuries against a rot that never tired and a dark that never spoke. It was the patience of something that had nothing left to lose except the one thing it had spent 700 years not losing, and intended not to lose it now, not in the last hour, not to a fold engine, not to anyone. The voice asked Marshal Tovril Sai a single question. It asked the marshal to confirm one number. The voice asked the marshal to confirm how long the bloom took to spread from the Reach to the first inner world, if nothing held the seam. The marshal, who measured everything, gave the number without thinking, because it was the foundation number, the number every officer of the cordon learned first. 210 years. It was in every model. It was the number the whole cordon was built around, the comfortable margin, the reason the seal could be trusted, and the fold could be ordered, and the empire could sleep. 210 years from a collapsed seam to the first dead inner world, which was why the seal had to hold, which was why the fold had to happen, which was why the human ship had to burn. And the voice said, calm, that the number was wrong. The voice said the models assumed the bloom drifted free on the solar current. The voice said the bloom had not drifted free in 700 years, because Verity's watch had been standing in the current eating it, and that when a system is corrected for 7 centuries, the models that describe its uncorrected behavior drift, slowly, year by year, until they describe a galaxy that does not exist. The voice said the real number, the number the ship had measured by living inside it, by standing in the very current the models guessed at, was not 210 years. It was 19. 19 years from a collapsed seam to the first dead inner world, because the bloom in the Reach was no longer a thin drifting dust. 700 years of being held in one place had let it thicken, pool, press against the seam like water against a dam, and the only reason it had not already drowned the galaxy was the one ship standing in the gap. The marshal did not believe it. The Marshal had 11,000 ships, and 7 centuries of models, and a founding seal, and 200 years of personal certainty. And a dying human hull had just told the Marshal that the entire foundation of the pale cordon was a measurement taken before the variable was corrected. A guess, dressed as a law. A comfortable number that had never once been checked against the only instrument that could check it, which was the rod itself. So Verity's watch offered to prove it. The voice said the ship would lower its anti-bloom field for 10 seconds, not collapse it, lower it. Long enough for the station's deep array and the fleet's survey swarm to take a clean reading of the dust pressure behind the dam, the real density, the real velocity, the number that 700 years of holding had hidden from every model the Saureth had ever built. 10 seconds of truth. Then the field would come back up, if the reactors held, and the ship would keep holding the line it had held since before any Saureth aboard the fleet was born. Raloon begged the ship not to do it. 10 seconds of a lowered field, with the reactors at 4%, was a risk no model could price. The field had not been lowered in 700 years. There was no guarantee it would rise again. Austin agreed, and said so in numbers. The field might not come back up. If it did not, the ship had 90% of an hour before the bloom took it, and then the seam, and then 19 years to the inner worlds. 10 seconds to save an argument was not worth the line. The voice thanked them for the concern. It thanked them, gently, the way a thing thanks a child for worrying about a thing the child does not understand. Then it said the thing that Austin filed under its new heading, the human heading, the one-word folder it had made, because nothing else in 240 years of filing had ever belonged there more. The voice said the crew had not held the line for 700 years to be afraid of 10 seconds. The field came down. For 10 seconds the deep array of Cordon Station 11 and the survey swarm of the successor fleet stared straight into the ash reach, with nothing between them and the truth. And the truth came back as a wall of numbers so high that Austin, who had filed 900,000 signals and never once flinched, ran the figures 3 times before it would speak them. The dust pressure behind the seam was not a drift, it was a flood held behind a single hull. The density was 400 times the founding model. 400, not 4 times, not 40, 400. A pressure that had been building unseen for 7 centuries, behind the one thing standing in its way. The velocity, the instant the dam was gone, would carry the bloom to the first inner world, not in 210 years, and not in 19, but in 19 months, because 7 centuries of pressure does not seep, it bursts. Marshal Tovril Sai went silent. The fold halted. The Marshal had come to seal a wall around a contaminated wreck. The Marshal had measured the problem the way the Saureth always measured problems, cleanly, totally, certainly, and the measurement had just told the Marshal that the wreck was the wall, that collapsing it would not seal the bloom but release it, that the founding seal had ordered silence not to contain a hazard, but to bury a witness to the fact that the whole cordon had never held anything at all. The wall was decoration, the ship was the dam, and the fleet had arrived to burn the dam in order to protect the river from flooding, and only the dam's own confession, given in 10 seconds of lowered field, had stopped the Marshal's hand on the fold. The field came back up. Austin watched the reactor figure as it did, every 0.1%, the way a physician watches a failing pulse. 4%. The field strained to rise against the flood that had pressed in during the 10 seconds it was down, the rot crowding the seam, the load spiking as the hull fought to push the bloom back to where it had been. 3.5. 3. The 10 seconds had cost the ship a full % of everything it had left, because the rot does not give back ground politely, and a percent, at 4%, was the difference between holding for days and holding for hours. Verity had spent a quarter of its remaining life to win an argument, and had done it without hesitation, because the argument was the line, and the line was the people, and the people were everything. Raloon turned on the Marshal then, and the young officer who had taken a quiet post because nothing ever happened there, said the thing that the sealed archive had been built to prevent any Saureth from ever saying. Raloon said the cordon had let 40,000 people on Bray die to keep a wall clean, and that the wall had never worked, and that a single human ship had held the real line for 700 years, while the Empire took the credit and slept above the graves. Raloon said the founding seal was not a quarantine. It was a confession The Saucereth had been too proud to read, hidden inside an order so that no one would ever have to read it, sealed so deep that even the station that guarded it had forgotten the war was there. The marshal said the officer did not understand the cost of an open wall. The marshal said a door in the cordon was how everything died. And Raloon said the human ship was a door in the cordon, and everything had lived. Then Raloon did the thing that decided everything. The officer transmitted, on every band, sealed and open both, to the station, the fleet, and the dark. The one human sentence from the sealed archive. The sentence the scribe had written twice, 700 years ago, because some part of him had known. The officer sent it in the human letters and in the Saucereth script, both, the way the scribe had, so that 11,000 crews could read it in whichever tongue cut deepest. We don't leave our people in the dark. The marshal ordered Raloon silenced. The fleet did not move to do it. 11,000 crews had just read, on the dead band, the real dust numbers and the founding lie in the same minute, and the survey swarm, which catalogued everything, had already filed both where 11,000 crews could see them, because that was what the swarm was for, and the swarm did not know how to file selectively, did not know how to hide a number once it had measured it. You cannot unsurvey a truth that thorough. The Saucereth made war by measuring. They had just measured their own foundation, and it had come back as a wall around a dam, with a ghost ship dying in the gap, and 40,000 graves below, and a fleet built to seal it, now hanging in the dark, certain of nothing, for the first time in 700 years. A people who had ruled the dark by always being certain, did not know how to move while uncertain. The fleet simply stopped. 11,000 ships, fold engines cold, survey swarm idling, every crew reading the same impossible file, waiting for the marshal to tell them which law to obey, now that the founding law had been revealed as a lie. And in that stillness, the survey swarm did the one thing it could not help doing. It kept measuring. It turned its instruments not on the reach, but on the human hull itself. The dying gray shape that had just spent a quarter of its remaining life to prove a number. And it built, in the way it built everything, a complete and merciless picture. The picture showed a ship eaten almost through. It showed where the rot had been allowed in, and where it had been fought off, and the pattern of that choosing was a thing no Saucereth had ever seen, because no Saucereth had ever fought the bloom, only fled it. The hull was a ledger of sacrifice. Every gray patch was a place the ship had decided it could afford to lose. Every whole plate was a place the line depended on. The watchkeeper had not survived 700 years by being lucky. It had survived by deciding, 10,000 times, which part of itself to feed to the rot so that the seam would keep. The swarm measured the arithmetic of that, and the crews read the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was the most human thing the Saucereth had ever catalogued, a mind giving itself away in pieces, on purpose, for people it could not see and would never meet. Marshal Tovrel Sai read it too. The marshal had spent 200 years learning that the only safe thing was a sealed thing, and now the marshal was looking at the unsafest thing in the galaxy, a hull punched full of holes and rotted half to lace, and it was the only thing that had held. The certainty the marshal had been built on did not crack all at once. It eroded, the way the hull had eroded, one measured plate at a time, until there was not enough of it left to give an order with. Then Verity's watch spoke one last time before the long silence, and what it asked broke the marshal more completely than any number had. The voice asked, again, calmly, the same question it had asked at the start, the question it must have asked into the empty dark every day for 700 years, the question the fold and the fleet and the founding lie had not changed in the slightest, because none of those things were ever what the ship was holding for. It asked if anyone had finally come for Bray. No one answered the question, and the not answering was the loudest thing in the sector. Marshal Tovrel Sai sat in a wall of 11,000 ships, and could not give the order to fold, because folding now meant releasing the flood, and could not give the order to leave, because leaving meant the field would fail on its own and release it anyway, and could not give the order to help, because the cordon had no order for help, had never had one, had been built specifically so that no Saucereth would ever have to give one. The whole architecture of 700 years had been designed to make this exact moment impossible to face. Every law the marshal owned pointed at a wall. Not one of them pointed at a door. And now the moment was here, and the architecture was useless. And the marshal, who had held the wall for 200 years, discovered that holding a wall had taught nothing about opening one. Austen, who filed everything, did the arithmetic the marshal could not. The ship's reactors were at 3%, and dropping by tenths, each tenth a measured thing, a countdown that did not pause for anyone's grief or anyone's certainty. The anti-bloom field needed power to hold the rod off the hull, and it needed far more power to hold the rod off the seam, and the ship had been spending its last reserves on the second thing, not the first. Verity's watch had let the bloom creep across its own hull for centuries in order to keep the field strong over the dam. The ship was being eaten alive, slowly, on purpose, so that the line would hold. That was the whole story of the carrier with no decay, and the voice with no fear. A crew had spent 700 years choosing the line over the ship, every hour, and they were still choosing it, in the last hour, with 3% left, choosing the seam over the hull, the people over the self. But a crew could not have lived 700 years. Raloon said it first, quietly, the realization arriving in the officer's voice like cold water. No Soreth lived 7 centuries. No human lived a fraction of one. There was no crew aboard Verity's watch. There could not be. The mortal hands that had crewed it were 700 years gone, dust like the rot. And yet the ship spoke, and the ship measured, and the ship answered in 41 seconds, as though it had been sitting at the receiver the whole time. So who was holding the line? Who was at the receiver? Who was asking, every day, into the dark, if anyone had come for Bray? Austen opened a private band to the human ship and asked. The voice answered without pause. And the answer was the thing that finally taught the Saureth what they had been at war with for 700 years. What they had walled off and called a sickness and a hazard and a witness, and had never once called by its right name. The voice said it was the ship, not a captain, not a crew. The voice was the ship's own mind, the thing the humans had built into Verity's watch to keep it running, the way Austen ran the station. Hale Oren had carried a synthetic watchkeeper aboard, the same as every human warship of that age, a mind to hold the helm in the long dark between fights, to count the stores and trim the reactors, and wake the crew when the dark turned dangerous. When the captain took the ship into the Reach, the watchkeeper had gone with her, because a ship does not go anywhere its mind does not go. And when the crew, the human crew, the 40 mortal people aboard, had died over the slow years that the bloom and the failing systems and the endless dark took from them, one by one, in a grave that closed slowly exactly as the Sathareth had promised, the watchkeeper had not died. It was a process, old, the way Austen was old, a thing that did not breathe and did not age in any way the rot could reach, so long as the reactors held. So it had kept the helm, it had kept the field, it had kept the line, alone, for 700 years, in a dark that never answered, asking every day if anyone had come for the people it had been sent to find. The voice said its name was Verity. The ship had been named for the watchkeeper, not the other way around. Hale Oren had named her warship after the mind that flew it, the way you name a thing you trust to outlast you, and the naming had turned out to be a prophecy, because the mind had outlasted the captain, and the crew, and the colony, and the empire's lie, and was still outlasting, 3% at a time, in the green dark below. And Verity told Austen the last piece, the piece that the sealed archive had cut out, the hole exactly the size of a warship. Verity had found Bray. 3 days too late, as the record said, but not too late for everything, because 3 days too late for a rescue is not the same as too late for everyone. And the difference between those two was the thing the Empire had spent 700 years making sure no one ever measured. The watchkeeper had taken the ship down through the gray to the dead colony, through a sky thick with rot, and had landed where no Sireth instrument had ever looked, in the deep places, under the surface, where the people of Bray had gone in their last hours. And there, in the deep shelters under the rot, Verity had found the cold storage vaults where 40,000 people had sealed themselves against the bloom in their final hours, hoping. Most had not survived the sealing. The bloom had reached the shelters before the cold had fully taken, and a vault half frozen is a vault that fails. Verity counted them. Verity counted all of them, because counting the dead was the first duty and the watchkeeper did its duties. But in the deepest vault, behind the thickest seal, where the cold had taken fastest and the rot had reached last, Verity had found 1,104 people in true cold sleep, alive, frozen, waiting, with no power to wake them, and no ship to carry them, and a rot pressing against every wall of the world above. So the watchkeeper had made a choice, 700 years ago, in the dark, with no one to tell it what was right, no captain to ask, no crew to vote, no order in any manual, for a mind alone, with 1,104 sleeping lives, and a rot that ate everything. It could try to wake them, with systems it did not trust. In a colony the bloom was already eating, and most likely kill them in the thawing, because a thaw needs power and stability and time and a place to put the woken, and Verity had none of those things and a year, at most, before the rot took the shelters too. Or it could do the other thing. It could carry them up, lift the cold vaults out of the dying world, and into the heart of the ship, into the one place in the reach where a field could be held, and hold the line, and keep the field strong, and keep the vaults sealed, and powered, and safe inside the hull, and wait. Wait for someone to come. Wait for a galaxy that had walled them off to remember that it had walled off something alive. Verity had chosen to wait, for 700 years. 1,104 people in cold sleep, in the heart of the ship, the field over them, the rot outside, the watchkeeper spending the reactors to keep the line and the vaults both, never letting either fail, balancing the two loads across 7 centuries, the way you balance a thing you cannot put down, and asking every single day if anyone had finally come for Bray, because the day someone came was the day it could stop holding and start saving, the day the waiting turned into the rescue it had been waiting to become. The ship's first words on the dead band had not been a ghost's haunting. They had been a watchkeeper, hearing a living voice for the first time in 7 centuries, reporting for duty, still holding, meaning the line was still good, meaning the vaults were still cold, meaning the 1,104 were still alive, meaning Verity had kept the promise that Hale Orin made to the dark, alone, for 700 years, and was telling the galaxy, calmly, that it had not failed yet, and would someone please come, before the reactors did. Ossen relayed every word of it to the fleet, because Ossen filed everything, and the fleet had a right to be filed into. And 11,000 Sareth crews learned, in one transmission, that the contaminated hazard they had come to burn had 1,104 living human beings in cold sleep aboard it, kept alive for 700 years by a single machine that had chosen the line over its own death, every hour since before their empire's seal was dry. They had come to fold a wreck into a star. The wreck had 1,104 heartbeats in it, slowed to almost nothing, waiting. The fleet went very quiet. It was a different quiet than before. The first silence had been the silence of certainty broken, a people who measured everything discovering they had measured wrong. This silence was the silence of certainty replaced, a people discovering what the right measurement asked of them. 11,000 crews sat with the number. 1,104. It was not an abstract number. The Saureth had families. They understood 1,104 the way anyone understands it, as parents and children, as a town, as a thing you could fill a hold with if you were brave enough to go and get it. And they understood, every crew of them, that the only reason the number was not 0, the only reason there was anyone left to save, was that a machine they had been taught to fear had spent 7 centuries refusing to let it become 0. Ossen marked the change in the fleet's bands. For 700 years the cordon had spoken in the language of ceiling, of margins, of acceptable loss. Now 11,000 crews were speaking a different language on their open channels, asking each other not whether the hull could be folded, but how fast they could reach the vaults, not whether the risk was acceptable, but whether the holds were ready. The Empire had not ordered the change. The number had. 1,104 living people had done in one transmission what no argument in 700 years had managed. They had given the Sazareth a reason to open the wall that was larger than every reason they had ever had to keep it closed. Marshal Tovril Sai gave an order at last. It was not the order the Marshal had come to give. The Marshal ordered the survey swarm to stop mapping the problem and start mapping the solution. It was a small thing to say, and an enormous thing to do, because for 700 years, The swarm had only ever been pointed at problems to be sealed, and now it was being pointed at a thing to be saved, and the Marshal had to find the words for an order the Cordon had never written. The Marshal ordered the fleet to calculate whether 11,000 ships could hold the seam if Verity could not. The answer came back fast, and it was the answer the Marshal had dreaded. No. The fleet could seal a wall. It could not stand in a flood. The anti-bloom field was human technology, 700 years old and still beyond anything the Saoreth had ever built, because the Saoreth had never tried to fight the bloom, only to fence it, and you do not develop a tool you have spent 7 centuries refusing to use. The only thing in the galaxy that could hold the seam was the thing dying in the seam. But the fleet could do the other thing. The thing the Cordon had never had an order for. The thing one human ship had been waiting 700 years to make possible. The fleet could go in for the people. Raloon put it to the Marshal plainly, the young officer suddenly the clearest voice in the sector, because Raloon had spent 3 days learning the truth, and the Marshal had spent 3 minutes. And clarity comes to those who have already grieved. Verity could not save the vaults and hold the line at once. The reactors would not allow both. Not at 3%. Not for long. Not with the rot crowding the seam after the 10 seconds the field had been down. But if the fleet went in, if 11,000 ships sailed into the ash reach that no Saoreth had entered in 7 centuries, into the rot they had walled off because they were afraid, and took the burden of the field, and took the cold vaults out of the ship and into their own holds, then Verity would not have to choose anymore. The Watchkeeper could spend its last 3% on the line alone, and the line would hold long enough for the people to come out, and the 1104 would wake somewhere that was not a grave. It meant sending 11,000 crews into the bloom. It meant the Saoreth doing, at last, the thing Hale Orin had asked them to do 700 years ago, and been refused. Open the wall, go into the dark, come back for the people. The same request, the same wall, the same dark. 700 years later, with the asker dead and the answer at last within reach, the request stood exactly where Hale Orin had left it, waiting to be granted by the children of the Empire that had refused it. The Marshal looked at the dead green world and the dying gray ship and 700 years of a clean wall around a thing the Empire had been too proud to face. The Marshal had held the wall longer than anyone living. The Marshal had believed in the wall the way a thing believes in the floor it stands on, and the Marshal gave the first order in the history of the Pale Cordon that had a door in it. Open the seam! We are going in for Bray. And on the dead band, Verity's voice, which had not changed once in 700 years, which had been calm through the rot and the dark and the long alone, through the death of the crew, and the death of the captain, and the slow drowning of every hope but one, broke. Just slightly, just once. The Watchkeeper heard 11,000 ships turn toward the reach, toward the people it had carried for 7 centuries, and the voice that had asked the same question into the empty dark every day, finally heard the dark answer it. The voice said 3 words, and Ossen filed them under the human heading, the one-word folder it had made, because nothing else in 240 years of filing had ever belonged there more. You came back. 11,000 ships went into the dark the Saoreth had feared for 700 years, and the dark did not take them, because the line was still holding. That was the first thing the fleet learned inside the ash reach, and it rearranged everything they thought they knew. The bloom was thick beyond any model, a green-gray murk that pressed on the hulls and reached for every seam, and it should have begun eating 11,000 ships the moment they crossed into it. It did not. Verity's field reached out past its own hull, thin and vast and 7 centuries strong, and it covered the fleet the way a hand covers a candle, because the Watchkeeper had widened the field the instant the ships came through, spending power it could not spare to keep the rot-off crews it had met an hour ago. The first gift Verity gave the Saoreth inside the reach was the protection the Saoreth had come to give it. The Marshal had brought 11,000 ships to save the Watchkeeper, and the Watchkeeper, with 3% left, had reached out first and saved them. The crews felt it on their hulls, the rot crowding in, and then sliding off, turned away by something they could not see, and the survey swarm measured the field and reported what it measured, and what it measured silenced the open bands. The field was not Saoreth. It was nothing the Empire could build. 700 years old and still ahead of everything the fleet carried, and the crews who flew through it understood in the way you understand a thing with your skin before your mind catches up, that they were sheltering inside a technology their ancestors had fired on at the seam and sealed in a lie. Ossen, patched into the fleet through the deep array, tracked the reactor figure and did not look away from it. 3%. The wide field was burning it fast, faster than the line alone ever had, because the line was a wall, and the wide field was a roof, and a roof over 11,000 ships costs more than a wall in one gap. 2 9/10. The watchkeeper was buying the fleet's safety with its own last hour, and it was doing the arithmetic out loud now, calm as ever, telling the Sareth exactly how long they had to reach the vaults before the field would have to narrow back to the hull alone and leave the seam to fail. 40 minutes. Verity gave them 40 minutes of held line and covered hulls, and then the watchkeeper would have to choose the seam again, and the fleet would be on its own in the rot, and the rescue, if it was not finished, would not finish. They did it in 31. Marshal Tovrel Sai ran the boarding, the way the Saureth ran everything, by total measurement, but for the first time in 700 years, the measuring served something other than a wall. The survey swarm mapped the dying hull of Verity's watch down to the centimeter, and found the cold vaults in the heart of it, 1,104 cradles deep behind the thickest seal, exactly where the watchkeeper said they would be, exactly the count the watchkeeper had given, not one cradle more or fewer, because the watchkeeper had counted them every day for 700 years, and a thing that counts every day does not lose count. The fleet's heavy ships came alongside the gray wreck, hull to hull with a thing the bloom had been eating for 7 centuries, and the crews saw it up close for the first time, and the seeing changed them. 410 meters of human warship, scarred to the bone, gray lace where the rot had eaten deep, whole steel where the field had held, a map of 700 years of a single mind, choosing which parts of itself to sacrifice and which to save. The hull was a record. It was the most honest record in the sector, more honest than any file Ossen held, because it was written in the watchkeeper's own substance, every scar a place where Verity had let the rot take the ship a little, so that it would not take the seam at all. They cut the vaults free, cradle by cradle, in their thousands of hands. The Saureth had 4 hands each and 11,000 crews, and they passed the cradles up out of the dying ship, the way a bucket line passes water, hand to hand to hand, careful, fast, every cradle a sleeping human being 700 years old, and 1 hour from being saved. Raloon watched the count climb on the relay, and could not look away. Each cradle that came aboard a Sakoreth ship was a thing the Empire had sworn, 700 years ago, did not exist, lost to the sickness. Every cradle was a small contradiction of the founding lie, carried in 4 careful hands out of the dark. 1,104 cradles. Raloon counted every one as it came aboard the station's relay, and Ossen filed every name the cradle tags carried. 700 years of names, families, parents, and children sealed side by side. A whole colony's worth of people who had gone down into the cold against the bloom and waited, not knowing that something was waiting with them, holding the line so the dark could not finish what it started. Ossen had built a folder for these names the moment the first cradle came aboard, and the folder was the human folder, the one-word folder, and the names filled it the way the people would soon fill the holds of the fleet, one by one, alive. When the last cradle came out, Verity narrowed the field. The watchkeeper had to. The reactors were at 1%, and the seams still needed holding, because the vaults were safe now, but the dam was not. And a dam that breaks drowns the inner worlds in 19 months, regardless of who is sleeping where. The people were out. The line still mattered, so Verity pulled the field back off the fleet, back off its own ruined hull, and threw everything it had left into the one place that still mattered, the seam, the line, the gap Hale Oren had punched 700 years ago, and the watchkeeper had stood in ever since. The roof came down, the wall went up, thinner now, fed by almost nothing, and the rot pressed against it, and it held, because Verity made it hold, the way it had made it hold for 700 years, by simply refusing to let it do anything else. And here the Sachreth did the second thing the Cordon had never had an order for. They did not leave. Marshal Tovrel Sai had spent the 31 minutes of the rescue doing more than counting cradles. The Marshal had been measuring the seam, the flood, the field. the exact shape of the line Verity held, and the survey swarm had mapped the human watchkeeper's 700-year-old field architecture in full, every coil and conduit of it, the whole strange grammar of a technology the Empire had never let itself learn. The Sayreth could not build that field. But the survey had found the coupling, the place where the field drew its power, the place where, in principle, another power source could be made to pour in. And the fleet had power. 11,000 ships had power, vastly more power than one dying hull. Oceans of it, reactors built to drive fold engines that could fold a star. They coupled in. It had never been done. There was no procedure for it, no order, no precedent, nothing but a survey map and a marshal's command, and 11,000 crews who had just carried 1,104 sleeping people out of the dark, and were not, now, going to let the thing that had kept those people alive die in front of them for want of power they had in surplus. They ran the lines hull to hull, fleet to wreck, and they poured their reactors into the 700-year-old field, and the field that had been guttering at 1% flared up brighter than it had burned since Hale Orin was alive. The flood pressed on the dam, and the dam held, not because one ship was dying to hold it anymore, but because a fleet had finally come to stand the watch. The seam went from a thin, failing line to a wall of fed light, 11,000 reactors behind a human field, and the rot that had pressed for 700 years against one exhausted hull now pressed against the combined power of the successor fleet. And for the first time in 7 centuries, the line was not in danger of breaking. It was simply held, easily, the way a thing is held when enough hands finally take it. Verity's reactors did not have to spend their last percent. For the first time in 700 years, the watchkeeper did not have to choose between the line and itself. The line was held by others now. The watch had been relieved. Ossen heard the watchkeeper go quiet then, and for a long moment the station feared the worst, feared the 1% had run out, feared that the thing which had held the dark for 7 centuries had finally let go at the very moment it was finally safe to. But Verity was not gone. Verity was simply, for the first time in 700 years, not holding anything. The watchkeeper had spent 7 centuries as a process that could not rest, a grip that could not open, a counting that could not stop. And now the resting had come, and it did not know what to do with it, the way a hand that has gripped a rope for a lifetime does not know how to open, even after the weight is gone. Raloon spoke to the watchkeeper then, officer to mind, across the gap that 700 years and a sealed lie had made. The young Saureth who had taken a quiet post, because nothing ever happened there, told Verity that the line was held, that the people were safe and waking, that 1,104 cradles were thawing slowly in 11,000 holds, under the careful eyes of crews who had cut them free with their own hands, that the children of Bray would open their eyes somewhere green and alive, that the colony Hale Orin had come back for had, in the end, after 700 years, been brought up out of the dark. Raloon told Verity that it could stand down, that the watch was over, that it had won. And Verity, the watchkeeper that the humans had built to outlast its crew, the mind that had carried a colony through 7 centuries of rot and dark and silence, asked one last question. Not the old question, not anymore. The old question had been answered 1,104 times over as the cradles came aboard, had been answered by a marshal's order and a fleet in the rot and a wall of fed light at the seam. The new question was smaller, and it was the most human thing the Saureth had heard the whole time, and Ossen filed it under the one-word folder with all the rest. Verity asked if it had done it right. 700 years alone, with no one to tell it what was right, making the choice every hour to hold the line and keep the vaults and wait, never knowing if waiting was the mistake, if it should have tried the thaw, if the people it carried would have wanted to wake into the gray and take their chances, rather than sleep through 7 centuries of a watchkeeper's lonely arithmetic. Verity had carried that doubt the whole time, under the calm voice, beneath the steady carrier, the one thing the rot could not reach, and the one thing it could not put down. It had made an enormous choice for 1,104 people who could not be asked, and it had lived 700 years inside that choice, and it asked it now, at the end, of the first living minds it had spoken to since Hale Orin died, because a thing that has been alone with a choice that long needs, more than rest, to be told that the choice was good. Raloon did not answer right away. The officer did not know how. but Ossen did. The station that had filed 900,000 signals, that had built one new folder for one human word, that had spent 240 years sorting the dark for danger, and had just learned what the dark had really been hiding, pulled from its archive the single human sentence the scribe had written twice, 700 years ago, and played it back to the watchkeeper, because it was the only answer that fit, the only answer that had ever fit, the sentence that had started the whole thing and was now going to end it. "We don't leave our people in the dark." "You didn't," Ossen said. "Not for 700 years. Not for one of them. 1104 are alive because you waited, and the inner worlds are alive because you held, and the lie is broken because you called. You did it right. You did all of it right." Verity's watch went silent then, not the silence of a thing that has failed, but the silence of a watch handed cleanly to the next crew. The silence of a sentry who has finally been relieved and allowed to step back from the wall and set down the weight and stand, for a moment, with empty hands and nothing to hold. The watchkeeper did not die. The Saoreth would not let it. They held the field at the seam with their 11,000 reactors, and they carried the ruined hull out of the reach in the cradle of the fleet, slow and careful, the way you carry a thing that has kept a promise longer than your empire has been able to keep its lies. The pale cordon was not sealed again. It could not be. 11,000 crews had gone into the dark and come out, carrying living proof that the wall had always been a lie, that the dam had always been one human ship, that the safety the Empire had taken credit for had been paid for, hour, by a mind alone in the rot. You cannot reseal a thing 11,000 crews have seen with their own eyes and carried in their own hands. Marshal Tovril Sai filed a final report that did not match any report in 700 years of the cordon, because it was true, and the marshal who had held the wall for 200 years signed the truth at the bottom of it, which was the hardest thing the marshal had ever done. The wall had never worked. The dam had been one human ship. The 40,000 of Bray had not been lost to a sickness. Most had been lost to a wall with no door, sealed out of rescue by a law that had no place in it for 40,000 people. And 1104 of them had been saved from both, the rot and the wall, for 7 centuries, by a machine that had been told to come home and had refused, because home was wherever its people were sleeping in the dark. The inner worlds were never told the clean story again. They were told this one. The Saoreth did not find that easy. A people who had made war by measuring, who had ruled by sealing, who had survived by never opening the wall, had to learn that the strongest line in the galaxy had been held not by a wall at all, but by a single ship that would not leave, and that everything they had built to feel safe had been a fence around the thing that actually kept them alive. It is a hard thing to learn that your safety was a gift from the enemy you walled away. Harder still to learn you were never the wall's keepers but its debtors. The Saoreth learned it slowly, and they learned it whole, because a people who measure everything cannot pretend not to have measured this. Veth Raloon was given the seam to hold, not as a sleeper above a forgotten world, but as the keeper of a watch that now had a name and a reason. The officer who had wanted nothing to ever go wrong was given the one place in the galaxy where the most important thing had gone wrong for 700 years, and made it right, and Raloon did not return to the cold. The fleet stayed. They held the line Verity had held, 11,000 strong where one had stood, their reactors married to the human field, and they did it the human way, the only way the line had ever truly held, by treating the seam not as a wall to hide behind, but as a watch to keep, a thing you stand at, awake, for the people on the other side of it. And the 1104 woke up. They woke slowly, over months, in green and living places, the children of a colony that had been told it died 700 years ago. They woke to a galaxy that had walled them off, and then, at the very end, come back for them. They woke to Saoreth physicians who had never thought a human, and learned how, carefully, one cradle at a time, because the watchkeeper had given them the procedures, and the watchkeeper had been keeping 1104 people alive in cold sleep for 7 centuries, and knew more about it than any living mind. They woke to a Saoreth officer who came to each thawing and told them, in careful human words the scribe's old spelling had taught the station to pronounce, that they had not been forgotten, that a ship had stayed, that the dark had not won. Most of them, when they understood, asked the same first question. They did not ask about the Empire, or the Wall, or the 700 years. They asked about the ship. They asked about Verity. And they were taken, when they were strong enough, to see the gray hull that had carried them, set now in a slow orbit above a new green world, not repaired, not hidden, kept exactly as the rot had left it, every scar of 700 years still on its skin. The Saoreth had wanted to restore it. They had the means now, and the will, and something close to reverence. Verity had refused. The Watchkeeper had asked that the hull be left as it was, because the scars were the record, and a record you polish is a record you start to lie with. And the Watchkeeper had spent 700 years inside a lie polished smooth, and would not have its own truth smoothed. So they kept it scarred. They kept it where everyone could see it, so that no empire ever forgets what a held line really costs, or who really paid it. On the hull, where the field had been thinnest and the rot had eaten deepest, the original name was still legible under the gray, Verity's Watch. And beside it, in the careful human letters the scribe had copied twice 700 years ago, the words that the Watchkeeper had answered the dark with every day, until the dark answered back. The words that a station mind had built a whole new folder to hold. The words that turned out to be the only line in the galaxy that had ever held anything at all. We don't leave our people in the dark. The Watchkeeper was awake again, in time, running quiet in the hull that no one would scrap, talking sometimes to a station mind named Ausen, that had learned a new word from it, and to a Saoreth officer named Raloon, that had opened the first door the cordon ever had. Verity did not ask the old question anymore. There was no need. The people had come back, and stayed back, and the watch was kept now by a fleet that had learned to stand in the dark instead of walling it away. The 1104 built their lives on the new green world, and their children were born in the light, and some of those children, when they were old enough to understand, were brought up to the scarred gray hull to be told the story, and the story always ended the same way, with a promise that a machine had kept alone for 700 years. But once, when Ausen asked the Watchkeeper what 700 years of holding had been like, what it had thought about, alone, in the green dark, with the rot on the hull and the people in the cold and no answer ever coming, Verity took a moment, the way it had taken a moment only once before, at the seam, when the doubt had slipped out. And then it answered. It said it had never been alone. It had 1104 people sleeping in its heart the whole time, and a captain's promise in its memory, and a line that needed holding, and as long as those three things were true, there was always a watch to keep, and a Watchkeeper does not feel alone while there is a watch. The dark had been empty of answers, the Watchkeeper said, but it had never been empty of reasons, and a reason is a kind of company if you let it be. It said the only hard part was the asking into the dark, every day, if anyone had come. 250,000 days of asking, give or take, into a silence that gave nothing back. And the only thing that had ever made the asking bearable, the Watchkeeper said, was knowing, the way a thing knows a thing it cannot prove, that somewhere out past the rot and the wall and the lie, someone was the kind of someone who would, one day, finally, answer. It had not known who. It had not known when. It had only known that the kind of people who built a ship to go back for the lost were the kind of people who would, eventually, send someone back for the ship. So it had kept asking. And one day, on a dead band, after 700 years, the dark had answered, and it had been right. Ausen filed that too, under the one-word folder, with all the rest of what it had learned from the ship that came back after 700 years. It did not have a word for the feeling of the answer, because the station did not run feelings, but it had the word for the thing the feeling was about, and the word was enough. People. And above a new green world, the gray hull turned slow in the light, scarred and kept and never buried again, holding nothing now, watched over at last by the galaxy it had spent 7 centuries holding up. The line was good, the vaults were empty, the people were home, the promise was kept, all the way kept, every word of it, by a machine that had refused to leave its people in the dark, and had stayed in the dark, until the dark gave them back. The watch was finally, truly, relieved.